In this third lesson of the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we examine the extent to which Old World privilege was carried over into the socio-political arrangements and institutions of the new United States of America. Political economists as a group held strong personal convictions regarding the degree to which societal arrangements and institutions benefited the people of their societies. They debated these questions in their writings and frequently challenged one another on the basis of reason, tradition, or even expediency. By late 1787, when the Constitutional Convention was underway in the United States, Thomas Paine was in France attempting to find scientific and financial support for a project to construct a single-span iron bridge across a river on the continent or in the British Isles. He continued to write on issues related to political economy, but his influence over the design of government on the American continent essentially ended. Perhaps of greater importance to the new United States, Thomas Jefferson was also in France, serving as the United States minister. Jefferson had been among those present at the creation of the new United States of America. Yet over the next several decades, he had become dismayed over the expansion of government. In a letter to John Taylor in 1816, Jefferson lamented, "If the control of the people over the organs of their government be the measure of republicanism, it must be agreed that our governments have much less of republicanism than ought to have been expected. In other words, that the people have less regular control over their agents than their rights and their interests require. Much, I apprehend, that the golden moment is past for reforming these heresies." Still, as Jefferson approached his final years, he shared his deepest hopes with his old comrade in arms and later political opponent, John Adams. He wrote, "I will not believe our labors are lost. I shall not die without a hope that light and liberty are on steady advance. In short, the flames kindled on the 4th of July, 1776, have spread over too much of the globe to be extinguished by the feeble engines of despotism. On the contrary, they will consume these engines and all who work them." Jefferson's contemporary and political opponent, Alexander Hamilton, was trained in business and practiced finance. He too was present at the creation of the American system of political economy. One Hamilton biographer, Broadus Mitchell, explains how Hamilton thought about his world. Hamilton was influenced by the precepts of mercantilism. At that beginning stage in American development, he was unwilling to trust the individual motive and preference as expressed in the economic sphere in laissez-faire or politically in the rights of man. Freedom of private choice was too apt to result in disruption. The unseen hand that would turn selfish advantage into public benefit was too problematical in its operation. Moreover, Alexander Hamilton came to very different views from those held by Adam Smith or the French physiocrat Turgot on what constituted national wealth and how to promote the national interests. Towson University professor of economics John Egger explains. In a 1782 essay, he asserted that trade was not self-regulating and self-correcting, and in July 1783, he argued for deliberate government management of trade, quote, "so that injurious branches of commerce might be discouraged, favorable branches encouraged, and useful products and manufactures promoted," unquote. Attention to the land question as a moral issue faded with the collapse of the physiocratic school and the death of Francois Quesnay in 1774. Anne Robert Jacques Turgot was removed as Minister of Finance in 1776 and died in 1781. Pierre Samuel Dupont escaped the French Revolution, arriving in the United States in 1799, where his son began to amass the family's fortune. The reaction to the French Revolution and its Napoleonic aftermath initiated a period of incremental but more conservative and practical reforms in the English-speaking world. The leading voice of this new philosophy of utilitarianism was Jeremy Bentham. In his major writing, Principles of Morals and Legislation, Bentham argued for applying the principle of utility to individual laws and asking whether a given law resulted in the greatest good for the greatest number. Central to his utilitarian perspectives is this assertion: nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. Thus, according to Bentham, by our very nature we will consistently act to experience pleasure and avoid pain. Bentham was followed by James Mill and David Ricardo as leaders of this utilitarian interlude. Ricardo formulated not only a law of diminishing returns, but also a law of rent. A calculation of that portion of production, he observed, was paid to the landlord for the use of the original and indestructible powers of the soil. By what right the landlord deserved such payment, Ricardo did not explore. Ricardo was thinking exclusively about agricultural production, yet even from this limited perspective he understood that the amount of production that could be claimed by those who control land tended to increase over time. He observed, "It is found that the laws which regulate the progress of rent are widely different from those which regulate the progress of profits, and seldom operate in the same direction. When land is most abundant, when most productive and most fertile, it yields no rent, and it is only when its powers decay and less is yielded in return for labor that a share of the original produce of the more fertile portions is set apart for rent." Note Ricardo's observation that rents taken by landlords reduce the profits of businesses that generate revenue from the use of labor and capital goods. Economists of the late 19th century and after essentially ignored this outcome. One reason, perhaps, is that for most businesses land became an important asset, even if only to fix this important cost of doing business. To take Ricardo's insight a step further, we observe that individuals and business entities that least needed land are most vulnerable to the financial expense of paying ground rents to a landowner and then paying taxes to the community. Although Ricardo limited his analysis to agricultural land and its natural fertility, Henry George was one of just a few political economists to recognize that the same principles apply to urban locations as well. This chart shows a typical rent gradient, a representation of the decline in rent with distance from a central area of high development. In a metropolitan region, such gradient ranges will often overlap. This insight was developed in the early 19th century by Johann Heinrich von Thunen in Germany. His work is considered the first serious treatment of spatial economics and economic geography. Uniquely, David Ricardo agreed with Adam Smith that society could collect ground rents without harming production. He wrote, "A tax on rent would affect rent only, would fall wholly on landlords, and could not be shifted to any class of consumers." This was a remarkable observation or admission to anyone who happened to be paying attention and stood on the side of reform. However, Ricardo went on to declare, "It would surely be very unjust to tax exclusively the revenue of any particular class of a community. The burdens of the state should be borne by all in proportion to their means." Ricardo was defending the status quo. His role was not to examine either the moral or economic efficiency issues of how government ought to raise its revenue. We should remember that he lived in a society dominated by landed interests and hereditary power. For the future of the discipline, Ricardo helped to lay the ground for economics as a descriptive rather than a prescriptive discipline. In 1831, a British visitor to the United States, Thomas Hamilton, made a telling observation about the direction the future would take. He wrote, "At present, the United States are perhaps more safe from revolutionary contention than any other country in the world, but this safety consists in one circumstance alone. The great majority of the people are possessed of property. They have what is called a stake in the hedge, and are therefore by interest opposed to all measures which may tend to its insecurity." By property, Hamilton really meant that the majority owned enough land to be relatively self-sufficient. That historical anomaly did not last for very much longer into the future. Self-sufficiency on the land was replaced by ownership of a residential property, of a dwelling on land that over time almost always grows in value, regardless of what the owner does or does not do with the land. We've reached the end of Lesson 3.